Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Zoom webinar on sanctions, what everybody needs to know. I'm really happy to have as our guest the author of the book, Bruce Jentleson. Bruce is the William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University, and a kind of longtime expert on both American foreign policy, the interactions between academia and foreign policy, and someone who's worked in government in many different capacities. So he brings to the book and to the topic of sanctions both a kind of a deep understanding, but also kind of real practical understanding. So it's a great opportunity to talk about something that's really quite significant at the moment, but has been an important tool of foreign policy around the world for many decades, if not centuries. So Bruce, welcome.
Thanks very much, Cal, and thanks to you and your team for hosting this. It'd always be good to be out in LA with you all, but you know, Zoom works well as well. And I actually want to, you're too modest, but I want to put in a plug for Cal's new biography of Ralph Bunche. Get it on your order list. Interesting person to learn about, and should be really interesting reading. So kudos to you as well.
Thanks. I'm going to hand it off to you now and let you introduce the book, and I'll come back on in a bit.
That sounds great. So yeah, as Cal was saying, the sanctions is something I've actually worked on a lot through my academic career. I mean, I go back to my doctoral dissertation and first book, which was on Soviet Cold War era energy pipelines, the Friendship oil pipeline of the 1960s, early 60s, and the Siberian natural gas pipeline of the early 80s. And so with Nord Stream 2, I sometimes think I've got my personal trilogy of Soviet Russian pipelines. And I actually started the book in 2020 with a general concern about sanctions and their frequency of use. And obviously the Russia-Ukraine sanctions have given it much more attention, probably than any case, at least since the South Africa anti-apartheid sanctions in the 1980s and before. I've worked on sanctions when in government, when I was in the Obama administration, 2009, 2011, as senior advisor to the director of policy planning. I worked some on the Iran sanctions. Way back in the early days of the Bill Clinton, Al Gore administration, I worked on the China Tiananmen Square sanctions, and in various other ways over the years have had some, you know, policy, experience with it. When the Biden administration actually did a review of sanctions before this case in spring 2021, you know, I was involved in some of that, wrote a memo, and did some conversations with those running the review. So let me, make. And I should say, by the way, the title of the book, it's a series Oxford has called, it's the What Everyone Needs to Know series. And every book has that subtitle, and it does feel a tad arrogant. So at least I can say that it's not everything everybody needs to know, but hopefully, you know, a good portion of it. Let me make 4 main points just quickly and concisely in order to move to the rest of the webinar conversation with Cal, and there's some questions from the other participants. And the first point is the frequency of use of sanctions, that even before the Russia-Ukraine sanctions, it was really hard to read the news and not see sanctions being in the news in one form or another. With the United States, you know, it's been really, not so much which administration uses them more, but administrations may vary about who they use them against and why they use them. Sanctions have been called the Swiss Army knife of American foreign policy, that they're used so frequently. But it's not just the US. China, which has long been a target of sanctions, and notwithstanding its criticism of sanctions as Western imperialism, has increasingly been using sanctions. A study by an Australian think tank identified 19 cases from 2010 to 2020, and there have been some since. And these don't count what I refer to in the book as the social media cued sanctions, which are not promulgated by Beijing, but the word goes out to the wolf warriors on social media. For example, the sanctions against the National Basketball Association, when one team executive tweeted support for the Hong Kong protesters back in 2019. It's one of the case studies that's in the book, and particularly interesting. I'm happy to come back to these later on. The Soviet Union used sanctions a lot. Russia's been using counter sanctions now on energy and natural gas, that I'll talk more about as well. The United Nations, which used sanctions 4 times in its first 2 decades, 1945 to 65, has used them over 40 times since then. The European Union has been using sanctions a great deal as well, and even other cases. Japan and South Korea have used sanctions against each other over disputes that go back to the colonial period and to the wartime occupation. So there's a tremendous frequency of use, which was part of my motivation for kind of going back to the subject that I'd written a lot on earlier in my career and had dealt with here and there over the years. Second point is, in academic terms, is the dependent variable side. How do you assess success? What do we mean by successful sanctions? And here there's a whole chapter looking at some of these issues as, substantive as well as methodological issues. And a couple of points out of that in terms of how to think about the challenges of assessing success, of measuring this dependent variable, as it were. One is, what's really interesting is it's not enough to have superior economic power. In some ways, this is like the assumption that if you have superior military power, you would go win wars. Well, that wasn't the case for the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan, and so far has not been the case for Russia and Ukraine. And with sanctions also, it's not enough to have superior economic power ex ante for a number of reasons. And one of the main ones is that the target of the sanctions has a number of counter strategies. One common counter strategy is to find alternative trade partners. Again, the Soviet Union did this for Cuba back during the Cold War. The United States and Western Europe did this for Tito's Yugoslavia when he was hit with sanctions by Stalin. Russia currently has been trying to find alternative trade partners in India for its oil, with China, although interesting, that may be changing a bit given some recent statements by the leaders of those countries. But alternative trade partners in some ways don't necessarily totally take away from the economic impact, but they can assuage it to a significant extent. There also are domestic offsets that countries use. Rhodesia, which was really the first major UN sanctions in the 1960s, when it did this unilateral declaration of independence, the UN sanctions actually had an infant industry effect. And over the first 5, 7, 10 years of the sanctions, any number of industries grew in Rhodesia that hadn't been there before. The Russians, with the ruble, which originally fell from 84 to the dollar to 154 to the dollar, by June was back up to a 7-year high. I checked today, it's at 61 to the dollar. Artificially supported through domestic offsets, but that's the point of the offsets. Russia's also increased retiree pensions and done company bailouts. And it's a bit of a euphemism, but we can also talk about offsets in terms of arrests and political repression. We've seen that in Russia, we've seen that in other countries. A third strategy is sanctions busting. Again, North Korea, according to a UN study, has raised over $2 billion in cryptocurrency as a way of assuaging the impact of the UN and Western sanctions. And then the fourth one is counter sanctions. The Russia example is very significant here in terms of the sanctions being imposed against Western Europe, particularly on natural gas. So you really need to think of sanctions as offense and defense. Again, just like you do with military force, what's the offense and what's the defense? Another point is, even when there's substantial economic impact, there's often a gap between the economic impact and the policy compliance. Costs do get imposed, but high economic costs do not necessarily lead to policy change. Think Cuba. Over 60 years of sanctions, significant economic impact, the regime is still there. Think North Korea. Think Trump's sanctions on Iran, which had even greater sanctions than the Obama ones, but did not achieve their objectives, regime change and the like. So imposing costs brings some success, but the fundamental goal of sanctions is policy change. And targeted sanctions also are used a lot. We were reading, today about sanctions against different individuals in Iran and the like. There's something called the Specially Designated Nationals, SDN list, that the US Treasury maintains. There's over 15,000 individuals and organizations. Some are related to terrorists, some are related to crime and drugs, some are related to Russia, Iran, and etc. So the notion that the higher the economic cost, the more likely policy change doesn't really hold up. There's also a question, and this gets a little bit in the weeds academically, but how do you count cases? Are all of the sanctions, say, against Cote d'Ivoire in Africa over many years, or against the Central African Republic, a single case? Or some scholars break those down to episodes when the scope of sanctions and the objectives change. Again, to use the Russian-Ukraine case, I would say we've had at least 3 different types of sanctions here. We've had the deterrence one, the threat, as President Biden said, that these would be devastating before the February 24th invasion that failed. And it's not clear that Putin was deterrable with his vision of greater Russia. But many other cases, sanctions used to deter an invasion have not succeeded. The League of Nations against Mussolini's Italy in the 1930s, who then invaded Ethiopia, Abyssinia. Saddam Hussein in 1990 in the invasion of Kuwait. The Soviet Union in 1979-80 and the invasion of Afghanistan. So the sanctions have, as deterrence, failed. Once the Russians invaded, the goal was, in good Thomas Schelling terms, was compellence. Well, again, costs were imposed, but it obviously failed to end the war and get the Russians to withdraw. We're in a third phase now, and I want to just mention this now, come back to at the end, which is sort of an economic war of attrition. The counter sanctions of Russia against the West, and the Western sanctions, really the global sanctions, not totally global, but with substantial support, over time, trying to break down those Russian defenses, the domestic offsets, the alternative trade partners, and the sanctions busting. The other point, I think, is that oftentimes leaders in the United States, we see this a lot, believe that simply by declaring sanctions, like for human rights purposes, we're sending the message that we stand up for these, or we're sending a message of deterrence. You may not change your behavior now, you may not end an invasion or a particular policy, but you won't do it again down the road. Here too, along the lines of my offense and defense, you really have to think of sanctions as strategic interaction. The late Robert Jervis always reminded us that the message sent is not necessarily the message received, that there are perceptions and misperceptions that happen in strategic interaction. And if the claim is made that we impose sanctions and that was done for credibility, you really have to ask the question of not just did the sender declare credibility as a show of resolve, but did the target take it that way? Did third parties take it that way? And so all of these elements go into analyzing what we mean by success. The other element that's very important is the ethical question. It particularly relates to the sanctions imposed for democracy and human rights. I actually testified a week or two ago to the Congressional Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, named for the now deceased former congressman from California, who himself was a Holocaust survivor and worked a lot on human rights. And here, there is this real issue of intentions versus consequences. That sanctions imposed because of human rights violations can risk posing a fundamental ethical dilemma of intentions versus consequences. If those sanctions actually hurt the people that you're intending to help, how do you weigh that as an ethical question, not just a policy question, against your notion, well, we showed we're standing up for democracy? So all of these issues come in. There's been a lot of good political science and other social science research on this particular question. And it's what I call in my book the problems of backfiring and misfiring. Backfiring entails effects counterproductive to the intended target state policy change, where a regime may crack down even more to show that it's going to stand up to external efforts to change. There's an article in the Journal of Peace Research a few years ago that empirically studied 95 countries from 1981 to 2000 and showed how sanctions regime cracked down even more on human rights, including torture and political killings. And then there's misfiring, where you actually hit the people, not the regime. And there have been a number of cases where sanctions have worsened life expectancy, infant mortality, child malnutrition, women's health, overall public health, clean water and sanitation, refugees and internally displaced persons. And one can say, well, it's because the regime didn't, allow any humanitarian aid to reach the people. One of the problems that's happened, Syria is a good example here, where particularly during the Trump years, where the sanctions and the fines and the threats of prosecution got so extreme that a number of companies, shipping companies, insurance companies, providers of goods, did what they called de-risking, where they were worried about even providing the services to NGOs, say up in Northwest Syria, that were trying to get aid on a humanitarian basis to people. But they de-risked because they were worried that they would pay a price for this. So there's a fundamental ethical issue that's raised by sanctions here as well. This came up with Afghanistan last winter. The question of lifting the sanctions for humanitarian reasons. I mean, we know the Taliban were still killing and arresting anyone deemed an opponent. They were repressing women. They held American prisoners. They had links to international terrorist groups. Yet as winter set in last year, David Miliband, the former British foreign minister and president of the International Rescue Committee, warned, quote, that the current humanitarian crisis could kill far more Afghans than the past 20 years of war. In policy jargon, you have to try to do what's called carve-outs to get this aid on a humanitarian basis, but sometimes that doesn't work either. So all of these aspects come in to thinking about what we mean by success. One of the proposals that I make in the book, and I've made in conversations with folks in the administration and at the UN, is you need to do a net assessment in two respects. One, you need to credit degrees of success. It can't just be a binary, they succeeded or fails. They may accomplish some objectives, but not others. But you also need to be sensitive to the notion where sanctions may not just be not working, but may be net negative because of the backfiring, because of the misfiring, because of what, to keep this going further, cross-firing and disputes you often get into with allies or costs borne by frontline states, Colombia in the case of the Venezuelan sanctions, Jordan back during the Iran sanctions. And then, of course, sorry, I'm going to take a little further, shooting in the foot with domestic costs you impose on your own economy. And you really have to have a sense, and you can do that prospectively as well as sanctions go along, with what's the net assessment between the likely cost to be imposed and the policy gains. Because if the sanctions are net negative, this notion that we don't want to use military force, we'll use them as the default option, it actually may crowd out, and I know from my own experience in the policy world, may crowd out other policy options that may be there and may be, even if they don't work, may not be net negative. Let me just talk for a second now about the independent variable side. What are the keys to success? And here I work with, again, coming out of the literature and policy case studies, 5 main factors that don't guarantee success, but help close that gap between economic impact and policy compliance. The first is multilateral support. Now, I have to say there are numerous problems with UN sanctions, including both the will and capacity to enforce them. And so they've actually had a very mixed record of their own, in part dependent on a number of other factors. But the more multilateral support you have, the more you are eliminating alternative trade partners. So the greater that support, that's an important factor. In the Russia-Ukraine case, these are not UN authorized for obvious reasons in terms of the Russian veto and Security Council. But what we've had here is many countries cooperating. Just to give 2 examples, Switzerland, which rarely cooperates with sanctions, has cooperated to a great extent with the financial sanctions. Singapore, which has never before cooperated with any sanctions that are not UN authorized, has also been cooperating with these. So there's been a significant degree, not total multilateral support with the Russia-Ukraine sanctions, even though they're not authorized by the UN. Second is a notion of proportionality. Sanctions are a limited instrument. And they're more likely to be effective when they pursue limited objectives in which the balance of interest is not so much that the interests of the target in resisting are so much greater than the interest of the senders in getting compliance. There are a number of cases where sanctions have worked for limited policy change, some human rights reform, some democracy promotion. I'll use a Chinese example. They imposed sanctions against Norway when Lin Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize. And they didn't get the Peace Prize to be rescinded, but they did get Norway to compromise on some other issues. So they didn't get their main objective, but they got limited policy change. Or against France, when President Sarkozy met with the Dalai Lama. He went ahead with that, But after that, many countries started refusing to meet directly, at least heads of state, with the Dalai Lama. So the proportionality limited objectives, the notion of ending a war, deterring a war, is not a limited objective. It's one of the reasons why sanctions have had significant problems in achieving that. Third factor is reciprocity. No country says uncle to sanctions. You know, I wrote another piece we could circulate as well a couple months ago about who's winning the sanctions war in foreignpolicy.com, because there's a study that's come out of the Yale Business School, which has been very helpful in the sense of identifying the number of companies, American and international, that have actually been self-sanctioning with these sanctions. But the conclusion of those doing the study was that we were driving the Russians into economic oblivion, catastrophic. Doesn't happen. Ultimately, with sanctions, there needs to be, the goal is to strengthen your hand for diplomacy and leverage. And here I'll make the point between the Obama-Iran sanctions and the Trump-Iran sanctions. As I said before, the Trump-Iran sanctions, which is called maximum pressure, did even more damage to the Iranian economy than the Obama sanctions did. But there was no reciprocity there, and there was no proportionality of objective. It was all about regime change. The Obama sanctions, which, as we recall, had the cooperation of Russia and China and others, had significant pressure on the Iranian regime economically, but had a limited objective of changing a nuclear, of getting a nuclear non-proliferation policy out of it. And the inducement was, if you do this, we'll lift these sanctions, which is worth reminding us that, by most accounts, including Israeli intelligence, these sanctions were working reasonably well before Trump backed out of them. So the Obama sanctions had both proportionality and reciprocity. The Trump sanctions had neither. Part of the issue here for the US is you need to have clarity and consistency about the criteria for lifting. Congress recently, for example, tried to put Russia on the state supporters of terrorism list. And the Biden folks resisted, because once sanctions are imposed through congressional legislation, to lift them, you need to undo that legislation. If they're done by executive discretion, executive order, and the like, then it's negotiating leverage for executives. So reciprocity is a very important factor here in the success. Last two factors are you really are targeting the domestic politics of that country. And I talk about the role of different kinds of elites, and this is very true in non-democracies, not just democracies. The power brokers either act as transmission belts or circuit breakers. To the extent that their interests are consistent with the regime resisting the policy change, they're circuit breakers. They break the circuit of the economic pressure coming in. To the extent that their interests are better served by changing the policy, they can become transmission belts, bringing the pressure into the regime. This is part of the question about Russia. Some of the oligarchs, frankly, are Yeltsin-era oligarchs and don't have much influence here. But, the Libya sanctions, I can come back to this later. I don't want to take too much time, but back in 2003, where the United States and Britain used sanctions negotiations to get Gaddafi to end his W&D programs, to make some concessions on some crucial terrorism cases. And the sanctions were there for a long time. Part of what was happening in Libya, certain groups were shifting from circuit breakers to transmission belts and bringing more pressure on that regime. So the domestic politics ultimately play in. The last point, and this will lead us back to Russia, is sort of companion policies. In the Russia-Ukraine case, we have sanctions combined with military strategy. If the Ukrainian resistance had not been as courageous and effective as it has been, and if the US and NATO support, financial and in terms of weapons, had not been it, we wouldn't be talking about sanctions impact. This war would be over. But I think the most significant thing about these sanctions, and one of the reasons why, while they failed as deterrence and failed as compellence, the jury is still out, is that they're directly hitting the military capabilities of the Russians. They're squeezing the economy, but that's an indirect effect. So that I think the figure now is up to 5,000 or 6,000 pieces of heavy equipment have been lost. And the semiconductor sanctions have been pushing the Russians to actually MacGyver semiconductors out of refrigerators and dishwashers and the like. And so to the extent that those are directly hitting military capabilities, they're reinforcing the military strategy Not yet decisive, and we don't know if they'll be decisive because ultimately this may be a military question. But that's very different, where your goal there is not so much to change the policy indirectly through economic pressure, economic squeeze, but is to hit the military capabilities and reduce their capabilities. And so that puts us in this economic war of attrition where the Russians are trying to break Western resistance, particularly through the natural gas sanctions against Europe. And at a time where inflation is running even higher in Europe, recession is there. There are major plants and the like that have already had to close down because of or cut back because of gas shortages. We in America that have been obviously very concerned about the price of gasoline when you start to think about home heat rationing in the winter. And so we're not sure yet where this ends up in terms of the economic war attrition, to the extent that there is a negotiated settlement. This will be my last point, which brings you back to the reciprocity. There needs to be thinking about, and I don't think this letter from progressive Democrats got there the right kind of way, but there needs to be thinking about, what is the diplomacy here? What sanctions would be lifted for what moves on the Russians' part in terms of ending this war? Because that ultimately, if the war is going to end, that's going to be the fundamental question. So I'm going to stop there in the interest of time. We can come back to a lot of this, but I wanted to try to give you a sense of both sort of the general arguments and something specific to the Russia-Ukraine case.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. So as promised, you and I will just chat a little bit. I'll pose a few questions and then we'll go to audience questions, of which there are already many. So there's so many dimensions to this book, and I really want to recommend it. Bruce is right that this series can sound maybe arrogant, but they're very concise. And in Bruce's case, this book is quite concise. He packs a lot into not that many pages. So it's a really good primer on the issues. So let me just start with, just maybe asking you what you see. Let me back up. It seems like sanctions are often viewed as a very attractive option, but one that sort of never quite or rarely meets our expectations. And that's a kind of through line in the book. You debate that point, and I think rightly point out that even deciding what is a case, as you adverted to earlier in this presentation, can be complicated. The literature on this, the research is a bit conflicting about how successful sanctions are, but nonetheless, we keep going back to them. So I guess I want to ask two questions. One is, what's the political dynamic that you see, and maybe you can draw on your experience in government, that makes sanctions so attractive? I have some intuitions about that. And then two, what's the paradigmatic example of successful sanction? So are there cases that continually crop up? I'm guessing South Africa, perhaps. But what are the cases that come to mind when people debate these issues? And then how does the dynamic play out when, let's say, for the U.S. government, the U.S. decides we're going to lead with sanctions?
Yeah, on the political part, Cal, it's very much this: don't just stand there, do something, right? Looks tough, you don't want to be trading with the bad guy. And it's not so much that you should continue economic relations, but oftentimes they're turned to as this default option, without the net assessment about whether they'll be net negative. And you really need to care about that from a policy perspective, whether it's you genuinely care about human rights or not, or even, from other kinds of policy objectives. And B, it kind of crowds out other kinds of thinking, and policy strategies are there. It's just this quick turn to them. And it can be a wasting asset too. The financial sanctions have been really interesting. We've, the weaponization of interdependence through the financial sanction. But a lot of warnings there about, while the dollar will never be fully replaced, this happened during the Trump sanctions with the Europeans, trying to find ways around the dollar. And is this continual turn to financial sanctions a wasting asset? Part of that is you get into, this is right up your alley, secondary sanctions, which raise issues about the extraterritorial application of American policy. The book I wrote about the West Siberian natural gas pipeline, Margaret Thatcher, who agreed with just about everything Ronald Reagan did, fundamentally opposed him on those Siberian natural gas pipeline sanctions, not so much for the gas, but for the steel pipe contracts that the British had. Recall the recession of the early 1980s. So this whole notion of really sitting back and even if you say, look, I know they're going to be net negative, but I still want to do them, I'd actually be happier with that. than just this default option, automatic reaching for them. Because I think sometimes you like to say, okay, let's look for a better policy. In terms of examples, so South Africa is in some ways an iconic case. But if you had done an evaluation of South Africa sanctions in the early 1980s and the US wasn't imposing them, but much of the world was for over 15 years, you would have said they failed, right? And in 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Apartheid Act sanctions. And universities. I was teaching at University of California, Davis then. I was in the faculty there, and I remember, student protests and efforts by the regents and the state of California to divest from companies and the pension funds that were doing business. Congress passed this anti-apartheid sanctions bill, passed by a Republican Senate, vetoed by President Reagan. And I know this is going to sound really weird, but the veto was overridden by a Republican Senate. And at the same time, Citibank was not rolling over loans because it was a financial risk. The sports sanctions were beginning to, and we've had those with Russia too, the banning from World Rugby and World Cricket were beginning to make Afrikaners feel like it was really affecting them. So you had, a number of factors that came together, and one has to ask, how unique were those factors? And they were fairly unique. We may want to talk about Russia versus Taiwan later, because that's come up a lot. Another example, though, is a number of the late 70s Carter administration, congressional activism and human rights sanctions against those Latin American governments hitting American military aid, caused some of those policies to change somewhat, contributed by the early 1980s. Reagan administration sort of continued this in their own way to, Argentina and Chile, and ultimately Brazil ending the military regime. So you had a limited objective there. You weren't trying to do regime change. You're trying to get them to do some democracy reform. So those are a couple examples.
Great. I want to talk about you mentioned just now, kind of, you don't want to trade with the bad guy. And you have a section in the book on the ethics of sanctions, and you mentioned that today as well, which I think is a really interesting issue. So, there are people who view sanctions as, sort of the less violent equivalent of, carpet bombing a city or something, and that you're going after, it's not a military target. It's not targeted at the regime often, though you talk about ways in which sanctions can be made to be more targeted. But oftentimes they have really detrimental effects on what you could fairly be described as innocent people. Just expand a little bit on how we ought to think about that issue.
Yeah, I think that, very much, this is part of the net assessment, to claim that you're doing things because you believe in the values of human rights. But if they're net negative, and again, a lot of data and evidence analysis about the backfiring and misfiring is there. There have been efforts to do targeted sanctions. The UN switched to targeted sanctions after the experience in Iraq in the 90s, Serbia. Targeted sanctions don't stay that targeted. Bad guys regimes find ways to insulate themselves from it. The effects hit the rest of the populace and stuff. And that's where I think we really need to be, more thoughtful and more straightforward, and think about what else can we do. You can give a speech that says, we're limiting trade, particularly in areas that affect the repressive capacity of those regimes. And we're doing a bunch of other things. We're doing a little information warfare. We're trying to help, we're not going to tell you how because it's quiet, the opposition and the like. Some of this is happening now in Myanmar, for example. But, and again, it's easy to grandstand on this, whether you're in Congress, I'm talking before about David Mayhew's classic work on Congress. They talked about credit claiming versus blame avoidance, and regimes and administrations do this too. But, if you get away from thinking it's a two option only world, either bomb or sanction, and you really try to think through other options, you have a chance of coming up with options. And they're a way to convey that we're doing what we need to do. We're being tough, but we don't want to do something that's counterproductive. I mean, you can write that speech,
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm sure we'll circle back on that a little bit. Let's pivot to the issue that's obviously on probably everyone's mind, and you do address a bit in the book, though the timing of your book made it hard to really dive into the situation with Russia and Ukraine. But how would you characterize the current set of sanctions in terms of Are they in fact the most comprehensive, the most intense that we've seen, the broadest base? What else is sort of worthy of note? And then how effective do you think they've been so far?
Yeah, I think that the ability in the first 4 6 months to contain the cost through those domestic offset measures reduce the impact. You know, raising retiree pensions, bailing out companies, artificially doing capital controls that are artificially supporting the exchange rate, help that. But, on the one hand, you can't just say, well, we just got to give sanctions time. We've been doing that in Cuba for 60 years, right? But I think that the capacity, even the Russian head of the central bank has kind of alluded to this in some of her statements, that the ability to resist them combined with, the pushback Putin's getting at home from the draft, from body bags coming home, are making it harder for him to say it's a special military operation and doesn't, the world's mad at me, but you guys don't worry. And so I do think that there is some sustainability there. Again, I really feel like when we overestimate that, we get back into this superior economic power, is decisive, and it isn't. And so I've really been pushing back about that and saying, yes, it's increasing leverage. The alternative trade partners is really interesting, right? So India increased its imports of Russian oil, I think from 2% of its imports to 20, because it was getting it at a discount, it was refining it, including reselling the refined products, right? China has not done anything close to the proclamation of a partnership with no limits that Putin and Xi Jinping did on the eve of the Olympics. It has had some trade. It's been a little concerned about secondary sanctions against American and European companies if it goes too far. It was very striking at that recent summit that Prime Minister Modi, came out directly to Putin and said, this is not the way the world should be. And Xi Jinping apparently sent the same message, because they may agree and the rhetoric's still there about Western elites and not accepting multipolarity and all that sort of thing. It doesn't mean India, India has a strong relationship with Russia. It's a major supplier of their military aid, and part of my thinking is maybe one of these people leaders can be an intermediary towards diplomacy that the Russians might not want to do with the US or Europe. So the alternative trade partner has been there, but I'm not convinced it's going to be as valuable over time. And to continue to hit the military capabilities, now the risk here, of course, is the escalation risk. Putin's losing and it goes to escalation. We have to deal with that as well. But I actually am feeling like these sanctions, because of their scope, and that they have a chance, again, combined with the military strategy, of helping get us to some potential diplomatic resolution of this.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go to audience questions. We have about 20 minutes left, and there's quite a few good questions. So let me start with this one. So the question reads, in your 1986 book, Pipeline Politics, you focused on energy sanctions imposed in the 60s and the 80s. You referenced this earlier. What are the major differences in the way that energy sanctions, have been imposed today, contrasted to the earlier cases you analyzed? So what's changed about how we deal with energy?
Yeah, it's interesting. That was the early 60s, where there was greater reliance of Italy and Germany on Russian oil. And the leverage we had of our allies then. There was a speech given by the German foreign minister who said, I'd really like to help my steel pipe companies, but dependent upon the United States, right? And you don't get those kind of speeches anymore. You're getting cooperation for their own reasons. The Europeans turned more to Russia as a supplier coming out of the 70s, the unreliability of Middle Eastern suppliers, the low price, the ease of pipeline supply, and they got too dependent. I mean, it's a basic rule of energy politics, right? You diversify your portfolio both by source and supplier, and they got too dependent. My own view is, again, if this war gets resolved and we spend the next 3-5 years sorting out the relationship between the West and Russia, longer maybe, projections of no energy coming from Russia, I don't think is going to happen. But I do think the lesson there is, over reliance, for Germany and for others. So the EU has some energy sharing agreements that they've made, across the EU. There are a lot of loopholes in it. We'll see what happens, when the need is there. I could imagine the Nord Stream pipelines functioning again at some future point. But there became excessive dependence. And in the early 80s, it was, the detente had ended, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. This was very new Cold War for Reagan and any relationship. But Reagan actually didn't succeed. Reagan actually had to concede on that, and that was the contrast, that the Kennedy administration was able to get the Europeans to step back, but the Reagan administration had to concede on those sanctions, basically trading it for cooperation on some of the arms control issues of the day. And so you began to be the shifts in the line. Today, I think we're all on the same page overall because of the nature of this threat. An invasion of, it's an interstate war. It's in Europe. You don't have to make comparisons to Hitler to say that there are atrocities happening there. And so this is like the most basic security threat for the Europeans. It's not just the Americans coming over and saying, hey guys, I want to convince you it's a security threat.
Great. So next question kind of, I think, implicitly references something you said earlier about what if you had two choices, or you basically have two choices of military or economic tools. So the question is, if not sanctions, what alternatives do states have to signal their disapproval of another state's behavior? What would you recommend to political leaders? So this is something that you probably experienced in your time at the State Department. What are the other, maybe not just what are the alternatives, but what are the good alternatives?
Yeah, so let me talk about, a tough case, China and the Uyghurs, right? Been declared genocide, not just by the US, by many others in the international system. And so sanctions have been imposed by the US to a certain extent by the European Union. And, first of all, the reactions of the private sector to those are really interesting. The Swedish retailer H&M and Intel, the American semiconductor producer, are both cooperating pretty strongly with the Russia-Ukraine sanctions. On the Uyghur sanctions, they've both been going around them. And so the ability to impose significant economic impact has been limited. I think again, those sanctions that most significantly affect the Chinese capacity to be repressive, technology sanctions, and you're more apt to get a degree of multilateral cooperation if you limit it to certain areas. And then, information, various kinds of the information warfare, efforts to put pressure on China in a variety of other ways. When many of our Asian allies are not cooperating with these, what's the message here, right? Is the message really one of resolve and credibility, or is it you can't even get your allies to do this? So those are some options, limited sanctions targeted specifically at the capabilities that are most offensive, rather than a general notion of economic pressure. Find other ways to bring pressure. There's probably some things you can do with cyber that's beyond my expertise, that don't necessarily bring retaliation, although we have the Chinese doing it to us anyway in some respects. So I would look for ways like that where you're willing to say, I'm going to do things that I think are most effective, because I think that's the best way to, make these, not be net negative.
Let me just ask an elaboration of that. So if there were, let's not assume necessarily an invasion of Taiwan, but perhaps a blockade or something slightly less than a full invasion, but with the clear aim of strangling and absorbing Taiwan, are there any sanctions that you see against China that would be realistic, either as a political matter that they would actually happen or that they would actually be effective?
They would definitely happen, right? I don't think they'd be effective. I think it's really interesting because what we're talking about, the Russia case and all the factors that have gone into making this a possible effect, interstate war, in Europe, atrocities, risk of escalation. We can debate this, but Taiwan is fundamentally an intrastate issue, right? And so your reach for international legitimacy, while you'll claim it, won't be as strong, whether it's an invasion or a blockade or anything. Secondly, is the economic interest at hand. I mean, just using the examples I used before about the Uyghurs, you're not going to get the extent of cooperation from global companies that you're getting. And third is the degree of global support. I mean, it was very interesting after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The new president of South Korea, conservative, refused to meet with her when she came to Seoul. He was on staycation. And that's an indication. I know I've spent a lot of time in Australia, and the Australians are concerned about China, but they're also concerned about the Americans escalating. So you would do some, but I think that, the notion that you can rely on this strategically needs to be disabused as you figure out what your policy options are. Again, even if you say you're imposing sanctions and you do, maybe because you feel the political pressure, but understand in that meeting room that this is not going to be a major lever. What other levers do you need to reach for?
Great. Okay, next question. Biden administration ordered a review of sanctions last year, but it doesn't seem to have led to any serious reforms to address the shortcomings, negative impacts you outlined so well. At this stage, is there just too high a political cost to reforming sanctions, at least in the US? Absent the collapse of governments we're targeting, are there any realistic pathways to refine US sanctions, given how deeply embedded they are within our foreign policy toolkit?
Yeah, I think the review made some measures. I mean, they were beginning to look at the notion of financial sanctions as a wasting asset and trying to, if you look at the report that's recommended, try to put in some of this net assessment kind of a calculation at the front end and as you continue to do sanctions. It was interesting. So this Congressional Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which is chaired by Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, Democrat, and Chris Smith, Republican from New Jersey, are the two main things. The reason Congressman McGovern had this hearing a couple of weeks ago and had me and a couple of others, including a European expert on sanctions, testify, is he's really concerned about the backfiring and misfiring, right? And ways in which, as a believer in human rights, he really wonders when we're doing this. The Venezuelan sanctions, there have been different studies done, and a significant number of aspects of the humanitarian suffering and deaths have been attributed to the sanctions, right? Would the negotiation, if you had done more limited sanctions, or I even used the example of Cuba, where in the early 2010s, Spain negotiated with the Castro government through the Catholic Church and got the release, I think the number was 62 political prisoners, for a limited lifting of sanctions, right? Didn't totally solve the issues of Cuba, but it's more progress than we've made by just doing it kind of all or nothing, right? So there are different ways of going about it in terms of, what's the proportionality of your objectives? What kind of sanctions do you use? And being conscious that, if we really care about human rights, we need to make sure we don't do more damage than has otherwise been done.
Yeah, that seems like a serious issue and one that's not that easy to assess. Let me just ask you about Cuba. You mentioned Cuba a couple of times as 60 plus years at this point. Should we end the Cuban sanctions?
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, I think again, sort of like Obama and Iran. You don't necessarily end all of them, but we should be much more. And Biden's very cautious in this. He hasn't even gone back to the Obama policy. He's got a lot on his plate. I was there in 2012, and during the Obama opening. And, one of the things I saw, and a lot of American companies will tell you, is, the Europeans and the Canadians, getting the hotels and getting the inroads. And, it's not that you sell your soul just for an export or investment profit. And it's not so much that the Cuban regime uses these as a rationale. That may have worked with different generations. I don't think it works with 3 generations after the revolution. But they're not achieving any political objectives, and that's a good example where the limitations are partly congressionally imposed. On you'd have to get legislation, and that's pretty hard to do. But so I think that I understand why Biden's not dealing with it with everything on his plate. But I think Obama was on the right track when he was doing that during the Biden. And I know you've got Ben Rhodes coming tonight. I might ask him because he was central to that whole negotiation.
Great. So next question. Given the costs and potential backfire of placing sanctions, how might we judge the efficacy of the threat of placing sanctions? towards achieving policy compliance? Under what conditions does the threat of sanctions achieve the intended result?
So my good friend and colleague, Dan Dresner, who writes a lot about sanctions, wrote an article a number of years ago called The Hidden Hand of Sanctions or Economic Coercion. And he argued there that sometimes the threat of sanctions achieves its objective without sanctions having been imposed. And it gets into how do you count cases. And there are a couple databases that take this into account. There are two issues there. One is, how do you define a threat, right? Is it that somebody in Congress gives a speech or does a tweet? Or is it, sent through a diplomatic channel? And Dan had some good examples back then. And secondly, it comes back to what, it's more likely to work when it has a limited objective, right? And so the Biden threat of devastating, and the language was used by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, it didn't have a deterrent effect. And again, whether Putin was deterrable may not have been, but that's where when you look at other cases, the threat of sanctions when aggressors have seen their interests as launching a war has a very poor track record, whether it's the League of Nations and Mussolini or the other cases I cited. So it really comes back to those other factors, proportionality. In some ways, the reciprocity is not imposing them, right? So they can be a tool like that, but in the Ukraine case, didn't work.
So next question, as sanctions are becoming increasingly common, and I'll just bracket as a sub-question, are they in fact becoming increasingly common? So that's something you can maybe address. I can't recall what you say in the book, but as they're becoming increasingly common and countries are trying to limit their impact, how do you foresee the global economy and supply chains changing? What industries and countries will movement be most likely to occur in? So in other words, how does the global economy kind of react to the imposition of sanctions? Interesting question.
Yeah, they have become more common, and including that, special designated nationals list, the numbers in Biden are higher than Trump, were higher than Obama, were higher than Bush. We have sanctions, the specific sanctions against countries over 30 countries. Then we have things like the Magnitsky Act, which allows you to, and some of the anti-terrorism legislation to impose, so it's even hard to count how many there are. And again, China's been using them much more frequently as their economic position has increased. They just most recently imposed them against Lithuania for opening an office for Taiwan in the capital. They imposed against Australia. By the way, they didn't work against Australia. They imposed against Australia because the prime minister had called for a WHO investigation of the origins of COVID. And also the Australians had cracked down on Chinese interference in their domestic politics. Just to throw out a number, of the $4 billion in trade Australia had, they got alternative partners for about 3.3. And so there was some effect, but not that much. And China didn't cut off iron ore or wool because they needed that for their industry. So anyway, that kind of goes off the question you had. I think that the financial sanctions are debated a lot. And somebody said, the concerns about the dollar declining is a little bit like the prediction of 9 of the last 5 recessions, but there are, again, it will always be a significant currency, but there's more trade being done by barter. The Chinese are developing, a currency. They're not ready to make the renminbi central. So, and when you say that they're credible, it's like, oh yeah, sanctions again, right? So I think that's part of the issue here is use them more strategically. So when you say you really mean them and you think you have a shot at making them net positive, that's more credible.
Okay, great. So, so next question. Overall, you seem to opine that sanctions generally do not work, do not accomplish their stated goals, can make the situation worse, etc. Maybe that's a slight overstatement of your position, but there's some truth there. Why then the apparent infatuation with them, their increasing and expanded use? And this you've, I think, already answered. Are they seen as doing something alternatives as an alternative to war? So you sort of answered that second part. That is a big part of their political appeal. But do you see the infatuation with them as growing? And if so, how do you square that with their actual empirical record?
Yeah, some of the databases give like 30% effectiveness, 20, 40. And again, sometimes there's a really good book written by David Baldwin, who was a Columbia University professor, about the ways we underestimate the impact by not looking at differentiated objectives. And I try to lay that as well. But let me come back to the part of your question that I didn't answer about global supply chains here. I actually think the motivation for that in the China case, there's some concern, not just about sanctions, but the general instability of the relationship, right? That's causing some reconsideration, as well as other countries providing more attractive or competitively attractive low-cost labor, right? Whether it's Vietnam or Mozambique or, Bangladesh to a certain extent. And I think the reshoring, of certain kinds of strategic supply chains, away from the Japanese, just-in-time model, has a lot of motivations. I don't think sanctions is the main one, in terms of that. But I don't think there's discussion about what's the term, decoupling of U.S. China. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're kind of like I said about energy and Western Europe and Russia. They're going to recalibrate what's the optimal balance point, and I think that's what we're doing in our relations with China. But all this rhetoric about decoupling, again, it's it's a little bit of the bombast that I wrote another piece called, beware the inflation of the China threat inflation, because we tend to inflate threats, in our politics and policy.
Great. Well, so we're almost at the end of our hour. So I want to just thank you, Bruce, for coming on. I want to note to everyone tuning in that in the chat, we have a link to the book at the Oxford website, which includes a 30% off discount. So feel free to buy it directly from Oxford at a discount. And Bruce, thanks for coming on. I hope we can have you back.